One of the coolest systems ever released by Nintendo is also potentially one of their most pointless. The Game Boy Micro. While it's absolutely puny compared to the original Game Boy Advance and it's hardly bigger than an actual Game Boy Advance cartridge, it's still really compact and feels really good in the hand. But should you actually track one of these down? What the hell is it, and is it worth owning nowadays? Or that's what we're going to find out in today's video, where we answer the age-old question: was the Game Boy Micro pointless? So welcome to Stuff We Play, home of everything weird and retro, and what we're talking about today is definitely both of those things, especially weird, and if that sounds cool to you, why not subscribe? So in 2004, Nintendo released the Nintendo DS, which was their successor to the Game Boy Advance. But a year later in 2005, they released the Game Boy Micro, which is an extremely slimline Game Boy Advance that lacked Game Boy and Game Boy Color backwards compatibility and was super duper small. It also had removable faceplates, just so you could customize it. So yeah, this can play pretty much every single Game Boy Advance game you'd ever want to play, but it also had some weird quirks. It didn't have any ports for a link cable, and also it had its own proprietary charger. You couldn't use a Game Boy Advance SP charger on it, or a DS charger. In addition to that, instead of having a volume slider like on previous Game Boy Advance models, it had a volume switch on the side. And to adjust the brightness, you had to hold the R button. What was pretty cool though is that instead of having a battery light, the start and select buttons would actually flash at you whenever it was either charging or low in battery. Also, weirdly enough, unlike the Game Boy Advance SP, this one had an actual headphone jack. What's very odd about the Game Boy Micro though, is that it retailed for the price of a new console. And while yes, it was less than say a Nintendo DS when it launched, you could probably buy a used Game Boy Advance SP for cheaper when it came out. So what gives with this? And I have kind of a theory. The Game Boy Micro is cool and it definitely looks cool, but it's not exactly practical. But Nintendo have done this before. What with the NES Mini, not to be confused with the NES Classic Edition, and the SNES Junior, once again not to be confused with the SNES Classic Edition, which didn't have as good video output options as on their respective consoles, but were released at cheap budget price points. I remember the SNES Junior in particular was only 50 bucks. Fast forward with the Wii, where we got the Wii Mini. A Wii that couldn't even go online, was limited to RCA AV out. That's right, composite, but it was a way for them to use extra parts. What I'm saying is, as cool as this was and as weird as the advertising was for this, the Game Boy Micro was a way for Nintendo to repackage something they had probably a bunch of leftover parts for and put them in this nice neat package. Granted, one flaw with this is that, well, the Nintendo DS and DS Lite also had Game Boy Advance backwards compatibility. But what's weird is it had the same limitations. So what I'm feeling is that a Game Boy Micro, more or less, is just a Game Boy Advance portion of a Nintendo DS. But the thing is, these things are going up in price nowadays, and if you want the best Game Boy Advance playing experience, well, just get a Nintendo DS Lite. There's no real reason to really own one of these unless either A, you think it's cool and worth the price, which for most people I'd imagine think this looks cool, but probably don't think it's worth the price, and also if you're like me and a crazy collector. Don't get me wrong, I had one of these when I was a kid, but I bought it for 20 bucks on sale for a game store that was going out of business. There's no real practical reason to own a Game Boy Micro. And was it pointless? Technically no, because if my theory is right, then it was a way for Nintendo to use up parts and repackage something, like they do at the end of most console generations. But is there any real reason to own one nowadays unless you're a collector?
No.
But anyways, I just really wanted to talk about the Game Boy Micro. But let me know, are there any consoles you really love that are honestly kind of pointless? Let me know down in the comment section below. And while you're at it, why don't you subscribe to Stuff We Play for more great content like this? Or if you want a more in-depth buying guide, maybe check out my recently released, well, actually it's been out for a few months at this point, Nintendo DS buying guide, where I go over all of that in depth. But anyways, thank you very much for watching. If you feel so inclined, why not back us on Patreon, because every dollar earned from Patreon does go back into the channel itself. Please stay classy, and I'll see you next time.